Recently, I polled my audience asking which part of a story or anime is most important to them: plot, character, setting, or aesthetic. And at the time I'm recording, 12,000 people have answered. And of those 12,000, 65% say characters. I think most people would argue that all four components and many more are very important. But for me and a majority of people who answered this poll, characters seem to have the most influence. Because great characters can make otherwise uninteresting plots, aesthetics, and settings fantastic. But what about when a fantastic character is a surprise, coming from a place you'd least expect? Maybe an undersold, wise, old imperial mage who has no business being so charming, that quickly solidified himself as one of multiple fan favorites, despite having a fraction of the time that other characters were given. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about how not all great characters are obvious. Today's video is brought to you by Skillshare, and this collaboration came at a perfect time. Recently I've been working on writing, not only in scripting these videos, but also in creating a fully fleshed out fantasy story of my own, which I have learned through past attempts is an incredibly difficult task. But I pretty quickly found a class that's been very helpful. It's called Creating Unique and Powerful Worlds by Lincoln Michel. He's a creative writing teacher at Columbia as well as a published author in his own right. There are two fundamental parts of developing a skill: practice and theory. And while you'll have to contribute the practice, having well-structured guidance can reduce the time and all the small points of friction that come with developing a new skill. So insert Skillshare, an outstanding platform built around learning and developing new skills. Skillshare has thousands of classes on a range of different topics. If you want to better understand writing, cinematography, filmmaking, animation, or drawing, there are numerous classes for all skill ranges, which I think is something that's important to emphasize. So often when using online resources to develop new skills, you can't curate for your skill level, which results in the time and effort you're putting in being less effective. I like that Skillshare gives you that information front and center. It helps you parse through their wide range of classes and find the right one for you. So if this is something that you're interested in, the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. Now back to the video. Frieren, like many stories I love, is built off of a foundation of great characters. And while the primary cast is great and I spend no shortage of time praising them, something else Frieren does that's really remarkable is create strong characters that feel like they exist off-frame. Often writing decisions in stories are made very purposefully. Primary characters and often secondary characters are the priority. Time spent away from them has to serve a purpose, either practically or to make the media more entertaining. Think about it, in almost any given story, how much time are the main characters not directly involved in one way or another? So if you're spending time and attention on these tertiary characters, it has to be worth it, otherwise people will be annoyed by the distraction. Now, while those characters are serving specific goals, it's very important that they feel real, like they exist in the world outside of their goal. Otherwise you risk a break in immersion, a world where outside of the main cast, everyone feels one-dimensional, like tools being used for specific purposes. So while primary characters are important, the quality and depth of those that they interact with and are surrounded by is an often overlooked factor in character writing. A great example of this is Avatar: The Last Airbender. I mean, Zuko, Katara, Iroh, Sokka, Toph, or Aang are all choices that people constantly make for their personal favorite, but there are tons of side characters you can point towards throughout the series that are also outstanding. The periphery cast that's given less screen time still feels like they exist off screen, that they're fully fleshed out people. From the reoccurring Cabbage Man to Sokka's Swordmaster, there are so many characters that fill out the world around the story, which is a really important part of world building and character design, to remember that this is a story taking place in a world, not a world that exists for the story. Or at least that's how it should feel. Which I think transitions beautifully into the topic of today's video, Denkin from Frieren Beyond Journey's End, a character that demonstrates these points beautifully, one that's given tons of little great moments and one outstanding one, with just a fraction of the time characters are so often given. There are three major questions I want to explore here. What makes Denkin's character so surprising? What makes him good? And what do those two things teach us about Frieren and storytelling in general? To truly understand why Denkin's character is so surprising, we gotta start first with some media analysis. Media in all forms has conventions, and then expectations that come from those conventions. Some of those things come from practical places, like take for example the vignette. It was a byproduct of lens shortcomings. But as people discovered artistic merit and it became more normalized, everyone started adopting it. I do it digitally. There are tons of examples of this in filmmaking and anime. Aspect ratios being another great example, a byproduct of practical limitations that became normalized and cinematic. There's even this genre of YouTuber that, as far as I know, originated from a channel called Cinema Sticks, where their thumbnails are just screen caps from a movie, keeping in the cinematic black bars. Now, with any standard can come subversion. A great example of this with aspect ratio is Zom 100, an incredibly underwhelming show built around an outstanding pilot, where we're introduced to the main character with the soul sucked out of him from his corporate lifestyle. They literally pull the saturation, removing all color from the shots, until the onsetting apocalypse frees him from that responsibility, and we see him break through the aspect ratio bars and color returns to his life. It's a really cool example of utilizing convention. But not all convention comes from a practical place, showcasing that sometimes people just do things because they're being done. The anime nosebleed gag showcases this. There's no practical origin. People are just copying the standard that's been set. Now, where this applies with Frieren and today's video is in character design. In anime, character design is used very heavy-handedly to guide the audience. It's a convention that's immediately visible. There's this popular meme from Yu-Gi-Oh! Which highlights this perfectly. Both colors and distinct design are used to highlight what characters audiences are supposed to care about. Stark is associated with red, Fern with purple. And I mean, Yugi has protagonist written all over him. He looks like he just left a 21 Pilots concert and could use his hair as a deadly weapon. The point is, no one bats an eye at all these distinct designs because it's so normalized. I don't think distinct designs is a problem. I think it helps create a lot of clarity in storytelling. Writers never want audiences confused unless it's on purpose. People often don't want to feel like they're working super hard to just follow the story. But if a writer chooses not to participate in these conventions, you can do a lot of cool new things, but it also has a chance to backfire. Take an argument that I made 2 weeks ago when I introduced Frieren's Mage Exam. In tournament arcs, you want a striking and intriguing ensemble cast. Gaara and Todoroki are good examples of that. But the characters that Frieren introduces in the Mage Exam are very undersold, especially by modern anime standards. I think this made it a lot harder for people to accept in open arms the change in tone and pacing that came with Frieren's Mage Exam. People don't like when you switch stuff up in a story, but it's super important for making sure that the story itself doesn't get stale and repetitive. But you do want to make that transition easier. And while there's been a lot of pushback involving the Mage Exam arc with Frieren, I think in retrospect, especially in reviewing, it really holds up. And my example of that is in Denkin, a character that by every modern convention seems uninteresting. But a perfect example of a periphery character done right, one that is so efficient with the time he was given, leaving a lasting impression on the audience and enhancing all the characters around him, from our primary cast to people on the outskirts. But what exactly makes him such a good character? Earlier I talked about how periphery characters are often introduced with specific intention. They're practical or entertaining, sometimes both. Using a previous example, the Cabbage Man from Avatar: The Last Airbender is mostly used for humor, so his purpose is entertaining, whereas Sokka's Swordmaster serves a much more practical reason. Sokka needed time dedicated to his development to keep up with all the benders around him, so the Swordmaster is more practical. There are tons of little ways in which he impacts the story, but his main purpose is in the way he interacts with Sokka's character arc. So let me ask you, those who've seen Frieren, is Denkin practical, entertaining, or both? Well, Denkin's at the center of one of the most entertaining scenes in Frieren, one that stuck with most audience members. And while I'll get to that in a second, I think he also represents a very practical part of the Mage Exam arc. Magic is a central theme of this story that's explored in a lot of different ways, but Frieren and Fern up until this point haven't interacted with basically any of humanity's magic. Outside of priests who use holy symbols and demons, human mages haven't been much of the story up until this point. So this arc in a lot of ways explores the world of magic, how others use it in their own lives. And the practical part of Denkin's character is demonstrating just how wide that world is. He's implied to be a cutthroat imperial mage, someone who's used magic to climb political rank. He also, as the older, more respected mage in the exam, works to contextualize Frieren's greatness. He recognizes Frieren and her holy symbol, an object with a huge implication that not even her party from 80 years ago recognized. Like I was talking about earlier, Denkin makes the world feel bigger. Small moments from him imply so much about the world. This doesn't just apply to him, but most of the mages in the Mage Exam. He's just the best example. And I think a big component that ties into that practicality and entertainment for Denkin's character is his charm. Charm is always a hard thing to define because it comes in so many different shapes and forms. Some characters are charming because they're not what you'd stereotypically define as charming. maybe awkward in a sincere way or overly blunt but living by the ideals they believe in. I think Denkin's charm comes from the nuance in his character, a highly ambitious imperial mage who's learned to be cutthroat, but he's not cruel. Someone who's built a lot of confidence through his experiences, but also learned to check his ego. A character who would seemingly be adverse to getting his hands dirty, but isn't afraid to. Denkin's drive is a major component of what makes him so charming, and where that's best demonstrated is in his peak moment. In the first stage of the mage exam, each party of 3 is tasked with capturing a magical bird. Quickly, people find out that that's no easy task. And it's made much harder by Friren's party. By freezing the main water source, it throws a wrench in everyone's plans. So Denkin, with not a lot of options, knowing that Friren's party has a plan to capture a bird, makes them his target. There's a solid fight with clever planning where Denkin's party almost comes out on top, before inevitably losing. But more important is what comes after. With their party's mana exhausted and little to no options, Denkin says it's not over until the bell rings. They find a party, disqualified through the death of one of their members, holding desperately on to the bird that they worked so hard to get. And in an iconic moment of the first season, Denkin says, even without any mana, I can still throw hands. A scene that works so perfectly with the character they've set up before this. One I've known since about a year ago when I started making these videos I wanted to talk about. A peak moment in an outstanding show coming from a character you'd least expect. Yesterday I did another poll asking from all the periphery mages in the mage exam which were people's favorites. Now Ubel performed pretty well for interesting reasons, but the clear leader was Denkin. Friren is a show that's truly unpredictable, because when writers make a habit of always subverting expectations, audiences just create new expectations. What makes Friren so unpredictable is the mix of engaging in trope and changing it. I think a lot of people struggled with Friren's mage exam because they felt like it lost track of what made it special. And while that perspective's fair, the more I've looked at the mage exam, the more I feel like they're doing all the things that made this show special in a different way. More serialized rather than episodic, interweaving more plot lines and characters, taking important time setting up a grand story. I was so uninterested in Denkin's character during his introduction. And then, in its unpredictable fashion, Friren made him outstanding, making a periphery character that you wouldn't expect to be good feel so big and so alive. One that obviously does serve some purpose, but still feels so human. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.